I graduated high school almost a year ago. I had really no urge to attend college or the military, and basically got stuck in my boring hometown for months, where I slowly became dependent on Xanax and booze, and was destined to repeat the cycle of white trash set before me by my parents and theirs before. I knew I had to leave town, so I decided to sign up for a website you may have heard of called www.oof.com, which stands for Worldwide Opportunities in Organic Farming. You pay a small fee, and they make available a directory of organic farming operations that will feed you and allow you to live with them in return for a certain amount of work around the farm. The place I decided to commit to was a Hare Krishna community in the Deep South. I got there, and my car almost immediately broke down. It was a 30-year-old Chevy Blazer that I bought off Craigslist for about $500. Later on, I was to find out that it was beyond repair at this point. The closest town was almost 20 miles away, so I found myself stranded and surrounded by the most unbearable hipsters. To be more specific, I'd say about a third of the population of the community were either first or second generation Indian immigrants living near the temple for religious reasons. Another demographic were aging hippies, also there for spiritual purposes, but also running the small-scale organic farm located on the property. Everyone else, however, was self-absorbed, condescending, and right out of college. I basically kept to myself, but occasionally was forced into conversations about vibrating crystals and their 3-year spiritual journey, no doubt being funded by their parents. I had been there for weeks and was desperate for a real conversation, and then Michael showed up. I heard stories about Michael a couple days before I showed up. He had left to retrieve an impounded car in a large city about an hour away. Everyone said he was lazy, insane, and would spend hours upon hours in his room doing yoga instead of coming down and working with the rest of us. He showed up late in the evening, going on about how he was going to really get involved with this farming. He was in his early 30s, and he was starting to go bald. His unwashed sideburns curled, and he spoke like a stoner cartoon character. His sentences were punctuated with and or and like, giving his utterly fried brain time to figure out what others wanted to hear. He reminded me of many of my friends that I left back home. We became friends fast, as he was the only person there who didn't give me the urge to bite my fingers when we spoke. We were both from Texas, so we talked about the loony conservative teachers we had in high school, football, and of course some drugs. And every now and then, he brought up the subjects that really sort of threw me off. He wasn't able to get his car out of the impound garage, so he schemed the best way to break it out. These plans involved firearms, pipe bombs, and mind control. He told me to come to the Hare Krishna temple to befriend some of the gurus and learn meditation. A certain form of meditation used to control the minds and bodies of other people. He told me that he believed he used it once to seduce a woman at a party. This is when I understood his reputation. I simply nodded and laughed occasionally when he went off on these rants. I knew that one day I would reach a saturation point for this absurdity, but I could probably endure it for another week. A couple days later, we were eating lunch with one of the gurus. I was telling Michael about my trip to the giant field where the Branch Davidian used to be. He wasn't sure about the Branch Davidian, so I explained to him about Waco, David Koresh, and the botch seize by the FBI and the ATF that led to the death of 76 Davidians and 4 ATF agents. He was enraged. The government is always trying to silence the people preaching the truth. That's so fucked up. I wanted to explain to him that David Koresh was a sociopath cult leader, interested in power and nothing else, but he wasn't having it. Now I was angry. He was having a tantrum about a subject, and I had just explained to him, and now he's telling me that I was wrong, and that Koresh was right. This is when I saw the truly insane Michael. He was spitting, red as a beet, and pacing back and forth. I left the table and got back to work, but he followed me. After about an hour or so of this absurd argument, I couldn't handle it anymore. I'm not having this conversation anymore with a fucking loon like Michael. How can I expect logic from you? You came here to get superpowers. The look in his eyes changed from anger to hatred. He got real still and went at me. Michael was a big guy, much bigger than me. He lunged at me and I ran. As I ran, I went through my pockets, praying I had grabbed a knife before I left my cabin. I know it sounds ridiculous, but you don't walk through my old neighborhood without some sort of protection. Plus, it was a pretty useful tool to have on the farm. Luckily, I had grabbed it and turned around so he would see it. He stopped and contemplated for 3 seconds. He quickly turned around and finished his lunch. The next day, I pulled the temple president aside and explained what happened and that we had to get rid of him. It didn't take much convincing. No one really cared for him, and he wasn't much help on the farm. I felt bad snitching on the guy, but he was in a pretty desperate situation. He had no car, no money, and I can't imagine he had many friends. The temple president also informed me that he had been an alcoholic for 10 years and had came here to get sober. I found it very strange that he never told me this. Later that day, I saw someone through my window drive up and hand him several suitcases to pack what little he had, and then I saw them drive off, God knows where. The weeks went by and the whole encounter kind of faded, and then late one night I got a text. "Hey, this is Michael. We can get my car out for $280. Want to go traveling?" I never responded. I wasn't sure how he got my number, but I figured he looked me up on Facebook or something. A few nights later, I was in the temple office using the Wi-Fi to make some emails. I was making the walk back to my cabin, and from the pitch black, I hear a loud banging coming from the barn. I remember thinking it must have been an animal, but also thinking that it must be a pretty big one to make that much noise. I entered my cabin. The actual door to the cabin doesn't have a lock, but my bedroom did, so I used that one. I was pretty unsettled by the banging, but I figured my imagination was getting the best of me. Later that night, I woke up needing to take a piss. The cabin didn't have a bathroom, but we had a shared outhouse. I didn't feel like putting on shoes and walking around in the dark, so I figured I'd just piss in the sink. I know it's gross, but I'm the only one who uses that kitchen. I opened up my bedroom door and nearly pissed myself right there. Michael, who was completely naked, was crouching in the corner of my kitchen facing the wall. I made a noise I wasn't aware I could make, something you would only hear Shaggy make on a Scooby-Doo movie. This noise alerted Michael to my entrance. All he did was glare at me and shook his whole body. I slammed my door and locked it almost immediately. I knew what he was trying to do. He was trying to mind control me with that weird meditation. I called 911. I didn't open my door or even approach it until I saw the red and blue lights outside my window. Michael wasn't there when they arrived. My guess is he ran deep into the woods that surrounded the farm. I explained me and Michael's history and what had happened that night. There wasn't much they could do since no one seemed to know anything about Michael. I didn't even know his last name. I had to leave the farm shortly after that. Calling the police was really frowned upon, since I believe that many of the old hippies thought that they were still avoiding the draft. I didn't mind leaving either. I couldn't sleep knowing that Michael might be outside in those woods, angrier than he was ever before. I stayed up for almost 3 days while I waited for a friend to come pick me up. When I was 13, my buddy Jake and I would spend a lot of time exploring and messing around in the forests and the mountains that surrounded our town. We would often go on night hikes, sometimes for hours when there was a full moon. It was on one of these nights that I had the most fucked up, terrifying experience of my life. A place we would often hang out were these old ruins that sat on the bend of an old fire road. There were 2 buildings. One was sort of a smaller shack, and the other was a 2-story brick structure without a roof. Apparently, they were once used for logging or something. There was some funny graffiti painted on the walls. One of my favorites read, "Casey can't give me a blowjob." I never paid attention to some of the other graffiti, a lot of which were long paragraphs and complete gibberish in red that took up the entire walls. During the end of our summer break, there was a full moon out, It was a harvest moon, when the moon shines bright orange in the night sky. We decided to go out and head over to those ruins, build a little fire, and look at the stars. We invited my neighbor and her friend to come with us, probably to try to play truth or dare or something with us. They were in our grade, and I thought the friend was cute, but they said it was too creepy out, and although they thought it sounded fun, they decided that they didn't want to go. To this day, I'm beyond thankful that we didn't pressure the girls into going with us. I know deep down that some horrible shit could have happened if they did. So it's like 9 p.m., and I meet Jake by his house at the edge of the trail that led to the fire road, which was a few miles up the mountains and into the forest. We both had backpacks with some water and some food, and some flashlights. We never really used the flashlights unless we were trying to get through some difficult terrain. We enjoyed relying on the moon and the starlight to guide us. About an hour into our journey, things started to get very odd. Everything felt different. I'd gone to the ruins at night a handful of times before and never felt this weird. The woods just seemed way too quiet. Although Jake didn't say anything, he seemed kind of uneasy as well, but neither of us was going to say, "I'm scared," and bitch out, so we continued right along. We round a bend, and the ruins come into view about 100 yards away. We're surprised to see the glow of a fire reflecting off the walls of the brick building, and we can hear voices coming from within. This wasn't the first time we had encountered people here at night. We once ran into some older kids smoking weed that turned out to be cool and paid us $5 for some Cliff Bars. But this felt way different. Jake and I both slowed our pace. For what reason, I don't know, but it was like our instincts were telling us to be cautious. I grabbed Jake's shoulder and we both crouched down on the path. We should hike up the ravine so we can get a better look at who's in there from above. I said that, and Jake nodded in agreement. We stealthily climbed our way up the back slope and stick to the shadows as we approach the ruins. The closer we get, the clearer the voices become, and we can hear that people are chanting and repeating what a louder voice is saying. We looked at one another, and each of our faces reflected a look of creeped out confusion. I think the both of us wanted to get the fuck out of there at that point, but we both just wanted to see what was going on inside of those ruins. We slid up behind a boulder and looked down into the brick building. Inside, there were about 8 people, men and women. Some were wearing creepy-ass animal masks, others were barefaced with ghostly white makeup on. All of them, though, were wearing black. 2 men were smoking what looked to be a meth pipe, but the most messed up thing was that this one dude had on a big antler-headed dress thing. It was like straight devil cult stuff right out of a movie. He was leading the chant, and they were all circled around a bunch of candles, set in a pattern with a big book next to the dead fucking black cat in the middle of it. Jake and I looked at one another, and neither of us needed to say a word. We both slowly retreated back, and we made our way down the ravine. We walked at a steady pace, crouched down, and kept close to the slope side of the trail, staying within the shadows. We come to that bend where the ruins first come into view, and as we're about to pass, we both hear the sound of approaching footsteps. There's literally nowhere to go. If we climb back up the slope, the noise would be easily heard by whoever is coming towards us, so we just plaster ourselves against a rocky slope and try to stay completely still in the dark. I watch the light begin to grow as it comes around the bend. Jake and I are both silent, and neither of us are barely even breathing. I pull out a collapsible knife from my pocket and fold out the blade. My hand is completely shaking. My senses are completely peaked. I've never felt such a flood of adrenaline in my entire life. The footsteps get louder and the light grows larger until a skinny, 20-something pale guy wearing all black and carrying one of those battery-powered lanterns walks into view. He was riddled with scabs. His mouth was hanging open, revealing brownish, very messed up teeth, and clearly a meth freak. He was about 10 feet from us, walking briskly towards the ruins. For a second, I felt like he wasn't going to see us, but then he just froze. I'm guessing his peripheral vision noticed the 2 shadowy figures crouching in the dark to his right. I honestly think that the guy was more terrified than we were. Jake and I knew he was coming, but we had no idea we were there. He had that deer in the headlights look on his face, completely shocked and startled. The lights on his lantern were weak, so Jake and I were only somewhat illuminated. There was this moment of complete stillness as we were just staring at one another. There was no wind, no sound, and all I could feel was my heart pounding like a jackhammer. It was like the world had stopped, and then me and Jake just blitzed the guy. We both smashed into him, and I guess it must have been the adrenaline, because we sent this dude flying, almost sending him down the steep ravine. He cries out and literally screams at the top of his lungs, and Jake and I just start sprinting down the fire road. At this point, everything gets somewhat blurry. The adrenaline high made me sort of black out for like a minute. Although my memory is kind of foggy, this is what I remember happening. We were sprinting down the road, and the guy is screaming for help. For a second, I honestly thought I stabbed the dude when we attacked him, but I glanced at my knife, and thankfully the blade was clean. I remember hearing Jake yelling as we booked it down the path. After the bend where we pushed the dude down is this long section of trail that kind of resembles a U and leads to another bend. As we were halfway to the other one, I look back and see 4 people chasing after us with flashlights. We round the bend, still sprinting as fast as possible. Then, both of us scramble up the hillside onto a thin deer trail that runs adjacent to the fire road above. We slow down to sort of a jog as we're trying to keep quiet and lose these Satanist meth friends. After a few minutes, we stop and catch our breaths, and we're both panting like dogs. Honestly, I could hardly breathe. "Dude, what was that?" Jake said, looking at me, completely trembling from the whole ordeal. "I thought I stabbed the guy," I said with my hand, white-knuckled, still gripping the knife. A few minutes pass, and we hear people arguing down on the fire road about 100 yards or so behind us. We stealthily make our way back up towards Jake's house. About 30 minutes later, we hear the distant sound of cars starting and tearing out of the parking lot that is a ways down in the valley at the other end of the fire road. Neither of us stop moving until we pass through Jake's back door, and we both literally collapse onto the kitchen floor, completely exhausted and covered in dirt. Jake's older brother strolls in and laughs at us for laying there like idiots, but he notices the terrified look on our faces and calls his dad to come downstairs. We tell Jake's dad about what happened, and he calls the cops. They show up and don't really believe or care about our story, and actually pointed out that we pretty much assaulted the guy and tells us to contact the park rangers. Then he leaves. The rangers come by the next day and says he'll check it out, but we didn't hear anything back from him. Jake and I gave up hiking at night, and I never went back to that place ever again. It was late August in Plymouth, Ohio, a place known to have some really weird stuff going on, blamed on a cult. I have no reference for this cult or real information about them, but this is our story. We were sitting on the roof of my cousin's house because the window out of Craig's room led right to the first-story roof, which was almost flat, and he had a tree right next to it, so we could sit out there almost every night that we were together and grab these cigar-looking things from the tree. They were green vegetable-like organic things, and I think the tree is actually called a cigar tree if I'm not mistaken. We would throw them around and hang out. It was a little past midnight. We always stayed up past midnight, and my parents would get so mad because I would be so tired the next day when they picked me up. I remember there were fireflies out in the field, which was probably 200 feet long and about 100 feet wide. On the left of our view was a country road, as we were in a very rural area, and across the road and down one block there was an old cemetery, which my older cousins told me horrifying stories about. On the right side of the view of the field was a small grouping of trees, and then literally a 60-foot drop straight down to a river. You couldn't climb it because it was very crumbly shale. That river probably cut out over a few hundred years ago. At the far end of the field from us, there was a pond. It was dug out with a bulldozer a few years earlier and was only about 15 foot deep, but there was only ever a little puddle at the bottom at this time of the year. I tell you all these details not to make you read so much, but so that you can understand the environment. I remember it being pretty bright out, almost a full moon and no clouds. We could see very well, and there was nothing to hide behind in this field. It was wide open, up to the tree lines that surrounded the property, and the tree lines across the street. Chris had just saw the man dog first. I was talking with Craig and Jen about some video game, and then Jen noticed Chris was staring. Jen followed his eye line, and that's when Chris and I looked towards the bank. The trees were providing enough shade from the moonlight that it was hard to tell what it was at first. Chris said something along the lines of, "Is that a dog on its hind legs?" Then it came out of the dark and started walking in the field. I was frozen solid, and I couldn't breathe. It made no sense into my head. It was a German Shepherd head that was literally attached or being worn. He was walking like he was drunk. I remember he was wearing a black plain t-shirt and dress slacks. He wasn't a scrawny guy, nor was he massive, but rather above average build. I'm not sure he could see though, but it seemed like he could. Anyways, I was scared and couldn't move. Jen yelled out, "Who's there?" The creature man turned and looked up at us and started walking directly towards us. And because we were on the roof, we were probably really easy to spot. The man didn't say anything. He didn't run. He didn't even make any gestures towards us. He just came walking. Craig ran up to the window, opened it, and climbed in. Jen followed, and Chris grabbed me and pulled me through the window. When we went inside, Craig told his dad, who was a huge gun enthusiast. His dad, after about 10 minutes, had a shotgun and was putting his boots on to go outside. I remember during that 10 minutes, there was noises of something pushing on metal, a door opening outside, which we think to be the garage door, and a really loud crash. We couldn't figure out what it was. My uncle went outside and started looking into the field, and being the stupid kids that we were, we walked outside the door to see also, but didn't go far. I saw blood all over the garage door handle. The garage wasn't connected to the house, rather about 5 feet across from my house, between the house and the field. My uncle ran around the garage, and we couldn't see him. It was horrifying, some very real horror film stuff. Chris spotted the man again, who looked like he was either coughing or laughing by the way his torso was bouncing his shoulders. The man jumped over the bank, and by the time my uncle noticed him and got across the field, he was gone into the darkness. My uncle called the cops and told my parents, and no one really gave it much thought. There was a posting on a few streetlights about a missing German Shepherd. A few weeks later, they found the decapitated head of a little girl in the woods by the cemetery that was a block away from my cousin's house. This house no longer stands, but I actually drove by the area in 2009. By the way, I left Ohio in 2007. I don't think I could have gone out there at night anymore, even now, me being 25. When I told my wife this story, I don't think she believed me, but when she met Chris, Craig, and Jen, each one, on their own, mentioned the story. My dad still says we were full of shit, and I don't tell anyone about it because I have no proof for such a weird happening.